Yeah, you wanna put that dish in your mouth.
Wish you could slide into my mind and make me mine. Push play rewind. Let's whip outside, and so am I.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dylan B. Dickerson White, Mr. Trans USA 2022, and I'm really excited here to have our conversation. A little bit of a rainy day, but we're going to have a good conversation nonetheless with our Miss Trans DC 2023, Anya Marino. And for a little bit of background, I had to write these down to get this right because they're pretty long. She's a former clinical instructor of LGBTQ plus advocacy at the clinic. I say I got it wrong again. At Harvard Law. And I think that's really impressive. But now is the director of LGBTQI equality at the National Women's Law Center. I think I got that one right.
You did.
And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the first openly trans woman of color in a senior legal position at ACLU. I'm sure there's sometimes things I've missed, but law is not my area of expertise. And I just kind of wanted to have you introduce yourself a little bit more in depth, because I know I didn't get everything in there or everything even right. So I'm going to let you take it from there.
Well, thank you so much, Dylan. First, let me say thank you to the national promoter and system founder, Gerardo Chavez, and to board chair Abs Hart for permitting me to serve the District of Columbia as its 2023 delegate. My name is Anya Marino. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a 39-year-old trans Latina originally from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm the director of LGBTQI equality for the National Women's Law Center, which is a fancy way of saying I lead and coordinate the law center's legal and policy work advancing the rights of LGBTQI people nationwide. As my bio summarizes, my decision to become a lawyer is deeply personal to me because of the hardship I encountered as a member of the trans community and as a person of color. My own personal experiences and the challenges I witnessed so many other members of the community encounter are the reason I spend every day of my life committed to advancing and advocating for every member of our community by working in concert with my colleagues at ACLU, Lambda Legal, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the National Center for Transgender Equality, GLBTQ Advocates and Defenders, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, GLSEN, HRC, and many grassroots trans-led organizations nationwide. And I will commit to advocating for members of our community until all community members are able to access medically necessary gender-affirming care without discriminatory insurance policies obstructing and obstructing their ability to do so, and without government overreach obstructing care. All LGBTQI children can go to school without fear of being persecuted and harassed relentlessly by their peers and educators. Our trans brothers and sisters subject to the carceral system are no longer subject to deliberate indifference of correctional officers who repeatedly ignore the physical and sexual violence their colleagues and other inmates inflict upon trans people. And more members of the private bar, meaning other lawyers, devote more time to taking pro bono cases to litigate blatant instances of employment discrimination against members of our community. And also to see more lawmakers and at the state and local government leaders really realize that it's completely inhumane to use trans and non-binary people as political scapegoats to desperately maintain power through fear-mongering and misinformation. So that's kind of a summary of who I am.
And that's one of those, it always gets me, like, that's just such an impressive sort of resume, and platform. And it's something that, you've put into your everyday life. And we've had conversations personally before, that and gotten into, hours long discussions and a lot of the reasoning too, knowing personally, like the story that you've told me. And I know that you may not want to share all of those details here about why you're so passionate about this and the path you took to even get to law school. But I think that, if you're comfortable sharing some parts of that journey, actually, and maybe even that beyond that, what some people who in your position, trans women, even trans men, other non-binary folks who don't see a lot of themselves in positions of power or as lawyers, doctors, other professionals, people who want to have that path forward. I think maybe describing your journey and some of the barriers you faced and how to overcome them for those people might be helpful.
Happy to share a little bit of that. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in the midst of the AIDS crisis, at a time when misinformation regarding HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, was pretty pervasive. And I expressed my gender identity authentically at a very early age, probably around the age of 4 or 5. It was no secret to anyone that I exhibited and expressed myself as the girl that I was. And it horrified my educators to the point that they alerted the administration of the school that I attended. And so the administration of the school I attended informed my parents that I had behavioral problems. They didn't provide much detail what those behavioral problems were, but they directed my parents to a therapist that said that they could correct what those behavioral problems were. So I was essentially enrolled in conversion / reparative / ex-gay therapy from about the age of 4 or 5 to about the age of 14. I don't blame my parents for that. I think they were really unaware of what they were doing at the time and simply following the direction of educators that informed them that I had behavioral problems. In addition to that therapy that I was going through at the time, given the way that I was expressing myself at school, many of my classmates and their parents were aware of what was being said about me by educators. And so many of their parents were directing them to avoid me, given how misinformation about HIV was prevalent at the time. Many people believed that really the only way that you could avoid contracting HIV was to avoid people who were perceived more susceptible to the virus. And so I was essentially a pariah amongst most of my classmates. And if I wasn't essentially being ostracized, I was being tormented relentlessly, both verbally and physically. And so from about the age of really about 5 until about the age of 13, when I experienced my first sexual assault, I really dreaded going to school on a daily basis. Following my first sexual assault at 13 at the hands of 2 of my classmates, I really spent a long time trying to figure out how I could just simply survive. That became my goal at that point, and identifying a way to escape Florida, where I grew up. And so I focused on my studies and really did my best to conform to societal expectations of my sex assigned at birth, which meant that I really threw myself into the behavior modifications that were mandated by my so-called therapist. I forced my voice down. I changed the way I walked, how I interacted with others, and I did my best to excel academically while essentially living a relatively miserable existence. But when I finally got to college, I came out. I came out as trans almost immediately. And it's in part because it's no secret that conversion therapy doesn't work. And if anything, is just simply psychologically harmful. And I am among the lucky few who survived it. And I spent that time following my coming out, really dedicating my time aside from my time studying at Hopkins, to doing a lot of community mobilization and advocacy. And also sneaking into the bars and realizing that I was really identifying more with the trans women who were performing among many of the bars in Baltimore and also in South Florida when I visited home than with many of the gay men who were patroning the bars. And over time, just really worked on many of the issues that were relevant in that period. And then sadly, my world kind of was turned upside down when a close friend of mine was brutally murdered. She herself was a trans woman of color. She was 26 at the time. She was battered by her assailant and her murderer, really, who then set her apartment aflame. And then she suffered at Hopkins Bayview Hospital for 6 days before she passed away. Her murderer, unfortunately, was acquitted of all charges, but he later was convicted of his wife's own murder about a decade later in 2017. But at that time in 2006, when she was murdered, I remember sitting in my apartment on University Street, across the street from the Hopkins Crossfield, thinking to myself, members of our community deserve so much more than what we experience on a daily basis. And I was among the very few that I knew at the time who had enough familial support that enabled me to gain access to a higher education. And so I had the means and opportunity to pursue a legal education. And so at that time, I began contemplating whether I was right to pursue a legal education, and looked around the legal community and saw that there was no one who had a story like mine or who even looked remotely like me. And so I sought out the advice and counsel of other cisgender LGB people that I could find, all who were white. And they informed me, they provided me two directions. The first was to remain closeted and to make a whole bunch of money in big law. And then the second bit of advice was that if I couldn't remain closeted, to go into public interest or to work in government. But none of them knew quite exactly how to advise me, given that I was a creature that the legal community had never seen. I was Latina and I was also a trans woman, albeit I had been unable to access gender affirming care at that time. And so I sat conflicted in my apartment and wasn't sure whether it was advisable for me at that time to really bring my full authentic self to the application process when I was applying to law schools. And shamefully, I chose to go back into the closet and to apply to law school representing myself as a gay man, and then attended law school as a gay man for 3 years and practiced law for an additional 6 years as a gay man, simply because I did not feel safe within the legal community. And it wasn't until I left private practice and joined the ACLU that I felt safe enough again to come out and be myself again.
Got me all wrapped up in that again, just because it's a story I think that I wanted you to tell. And I wanted to thank you for being really forthcoming with a lot of the details that I know are really difficult to actually rehash over and over again. And I think that That's going to be really helpful, especially as the next question. I know there are people out there, even now, that are facing similar kind of situations, especially since some of the there's a lot of legal regression in terms of the things that we're facing. So if there are people on that precipice, I would say, um, what advice would you give them if other trans people are trying to pursue law right now, or professions that they may be facing a lot of barriers to, especially in the legal context right now?
I think when it comes to the legal community, in some ways, it still is very much an old white man's club. I will say, however, there are components of the legal community that are indeed changing. There is a robust LGBTQ plus bar. And indeed, we meet annually at the Lavender Law Fair. And I just presented on, I think, 4 panels at the Lavender Law Fair in Chicago this year at the end of July, at the beginning of August. And then the year previously, I believe it was in Los Angeles. And then I believe this next year in 2024, it'll be in Washington, D.C., which will make me thrilled because I won't have to travel. But what I will say is the legal community is becoming more welcoming. And I think diversity is something that many within the legal community are celebrating more, given that diversity leads to innovation and creative thought. And it's something that not only firms recognize, but something also that law schools generally are recognizing at this point. And I think different worldviews and perspectives and experiences are something that are also being celebrated. And I will say that even within social justice organizations like the National Women's Law Center, or like the ACLU, or like Lambda Legal, different backgrounds and different stories are things that are sought out and sought after, because we want people with different perspectives, and we want people with whom our clients can connect. It's very important and essential to our work that our clients can feel safe and that they can speak freely with the advocates that represent them in court.
And I think, you absolutely. And I think that kind of hits on some of the things you talk about, the need for that, and that diversity and the welcoming aspect of it. Is because I'm sure you faced this same kind of thing when you first started, practicing, as yourself, or even interacting with colleagues, that maybe that you bring into the table issues that people just aren't even aware of. Not necessarily that they would be, they have any biases that they're aware of. Just like I said, they just completely don't even recognize that it's a problem. And, it's not even just in the realm of being trans, but just as a Latina, like there's things that you bring into that table. And just kind of wondering, was there an example of a particular issue that you were surprised your colleagues just weren't aware of, and how maybe something changed just by being there?
I think I'm not necessarily surprised by a lack of awareness of certain issues, because I think many of my colleagues who do LGBTQ plus advocacy are always seeking more information, and desire to connect with community members. I think perhaps one thing that they aren't always aware of is a historical and persistent amount of distrust that the most marginalized members of the LGBTQI community have in those who do movement lawyering. And that's in part because I think that historically, those who did movement lawyering really focused on the needs of what stakeholders wanted. So those who were funding the work, and not necessarily on the needs of those who were most marginalized.
Sort of
So
feeling exploited in a way.
I don't know if they necessarily exploited the most marginalized members of the community. I don't think
I
that's
just meant the
their
feeling, the
characterization.
feeling of exploitation.
I don't know if there was a feeling of exploitation either. I think perhaps there was a feeling of being forgotten.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was necessarily intentional either. But I think that many of my colleagues and I are very intentional now about really developing that sense of community with the most marginalized members within the LGBTQI community. And I certainly am very intentional about bringing cases and doing policy work that reflect the needs of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people, LGBTQI people of color, LGBTQI youth and elders, and LGBTQI people living in rural, southern, and faith-based communities, because those are the community members who are impacted most negatively by what we're seeing nationwide. And we need to be attuned to what's happening to them.
And that's actually brings me a lot into the next point I know we wanted to discuss here. And this is what I was looking up just to be sure. And I got these numbers from translegislation.com. They update pretty regularly, but I'm not sure exactly. So if they're not correct as of today, but I just want to put this out there. I guess it said in 2023, as of the last update on the site, 566 bills have been introduced in 49 states, anti-trans bills specifically. 83 of those have passed, 125 have failed, and 358 remain active. And just in comparison to that, looked at 2022's numbers, only 26 had passed out of 174. So all of these numbers, and of course the dogs are very angry about that too. Guys, don't cut that out. Get away from the door. So yeah, there'll be some editing. But so yeah, let's talk about those numbers. Let's talk about those communities most affected by that, because we know a lot of these have been in those states you had mentioned, but as I looked at the number, in 49 states, so it's everywhere. But I think that you hit on a point of being there for those most marginalized and the difference that we've seen just in 1 year. And how do you handle that? I know you've been really busy lately, but what does this all mean, these numbers, for you, for everyone?
So I want to focus on youth right now because much of my work involves the needs of youth. So I think it's important to just kind of step back and take a macro look at this and say that, trans and non-binary youth need only overhear the news media their parents watch or scroll through clickbait content and discussions pervading social media, or endure another instance of different treatment at home or school to feel like their lives and identities remain a constant topic du jour, right? And they navigate their schools and home environments at a time when their identities have great visibility while surviving persistent and relentless hostility at every turn. As you noted, there were over 500 plus anti-LGBTQI bills that were introduced nationwide. And deadly violence against trans and non-binary people also persists. In 2022, approximately 32 trans and non-binary people were lost to violence. And in 2021, approximately 57 trans and non-binary people were lost to violence in the United States, over 300 globally. And I say approximately because those are the numbers we were able, those are the individuals we were able to identify. There may be more. And government action, as you already noted, is steadily increasing. And the overwhelming majority of those bills concern the rights of trans and non-binary people. And an even more vast majority of them are targeting trans and non-binary youth, making them subject to surveillance, censorship, body policing, the inaccessibility of medical care, the inaccessibility of school programming and facilities, and in some cases, even at risk for family separation. Now, I want to be clear though, overt government action against LGBTQI people, it's not new. It's actually pretty old. One can look, if we're looking for another recent example, one can look at the Lavender Scare of the 1950s, which resulted in the non-selection of approximately 1,700 applicants for federal government employment and the discharge of about, I believe, 4,380 people from the military and the wrongful termination of about 420 government employees for being suspected homosexuals, as just one example. And when I say suspected homosexuals, homosexual at that time in the 1950s was an all-encompassing term that was used for all members of the LGBTQI community. I think what's most troubling right now is that the most recent attacks are different because they're targeting children, the most vulnerable members of the community. So how do we handle that? We handle that by, one, identifying who our opposition is, and by refamiliarizing ourselves with their arguments. Their arguments aren't new. They're old, and the opposition isn't new. It's old. So let's talk about who the opposition is, okay? The opposition falls into a few different categories. The first category involves the same groups that have targeted cisgender, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people for generations. Okay. Indeed, these groups have used the same rhetoric against trans and binary people that they've used against LGBT people previously. And the argument is that trans and non-binary people aren't real and that their behavior should be policed and prohibited because they are an alleged contagion factor that influences other youth to become trans and non-binary. And they also argue that medical providers and allies of trans and non-binary people should be criminally charged for grooming youth into unhealthy and unhappy lives. So the groups that do these arguments most prevalently are Family Research Council, the Heritage Foundation, the Beckett Fund, and the Alliance Defending Freedom. This is the first group of opposition that we see. Okay. The second category involves quasi-religious organizations that have a history of violence and abuse against women and girls, misogynistic institutions, anti-feminist institutions, okay? These organizations operate institutions of higher learning, churches, and homeschool programming that teach outdated and misogynistic views about gender. Okay, groups like Bob Jones University and Pensacola Christian College or Liberty University are within this category. Okay, the third category of opposition would be the trans exclusionary radical feminists. Okay, I don't think we should even be calling them feminists because they're not. They actually embrace misogynistic rhetoric. Okay. Now, TERFism, which is a short form for trans exclusionary radical feminism, also isn't new. It's been around as long as the LGBTQI movement has existed. Okay. One reason that trans and non-binary people were abandoned as part of the LGBTQI political agenda following the Stonewall Uprising was that many leaders in the Gay Liberation Front believed that trans and non-binary issues would harm the rights of cisgender LGBT people. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why Sylvia Rivera, who was a champion for trans and non-binary issues following the Stonewall Uprising, was booed as she stormed the stage to address the crowd and plead for trans and non-binary inclusion during the 1973 Christopher Street Festival. And then a fourth category of opposition are politicians who prey on the fears of their constituents. Now, most people, and when I say most people, I mean the general polity, at least to their knowledge, have never had any interaction with or do not know a trans or non-binary person. GLAAD, I believe, did a study, and it demonstrated that I think about 80% of the polity believe that they've never had any interaction with a trans or non-binary person. And so what they know is what the media and what their elected leaders tell them. And sadly, most media portrayals of trans and non-binary people are overwhelmingly negative, particularly the historic portrayals of trans feminine people in the media, which are often showcasing trans feminine people as unhinged or mentally unstable, murderous, hypersexual, or something deserving of another person's disgust. And so once we identify our opposition and their messaging, we start working on how we frame arguments to undermine what that messaging is.
And that's actually the next sort of part I was going to talk about. I know some of these main arguments, they'll be based on, let's say, biology. That's one of the main ones right there, or in sexuality and deviance. And there's whole schools of thought, obviously, that can talk about that. And it's a really long conversation. But I remember specifically a lot of the arguments being based on biology, things being innate. And we had a conversation a few months ago that getting stuck in the rabbit hole of this conversation on biology is really not productive. And I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about maybe that specific one, because that's what I see over and over again in a lot of the ones targeting youth, especially that specific argument about innate biology really just gets us trapped in a conversation. And maybe what's a more productive argument, counter argument to that, or a more productive issue to focus on?
Well, I think one of the issues, unfortunately, when we get into arguments about biology is that it enables the opposition to talk about us within the context of chromosomes, or in the context of our DNA, or in the context of specific body parts. It allows them to dissect us and to dehumanize us, which is their objective. We're no longer seen as entire people. They deprive us of our humanity. And so what's more important is to be seen as more than the sum of our parts, right? We have to be seen as entire people, deserving of equal dignity. And so we have to talk about our humanity and our real lived experiences. And we also have to talk about how their arguments and their effort to segregate us or to erase our ability to exist is not only harmful to trans and non-binary people, but is equally harmful to cisgender women and girls, and also undermines the feminist movement, right? So the very same misogyny and stereotypes women and girls fought so hard against to achieve Title IX, for example, are now being used to drive a wedge between classes of women and girls when they effort to allegedly save women's sports.
Right. And a lot of these too, I think I've seen several of them, just as an example, that are people, cisgender women getting targeted for not looking feminine enough, based on those standards, being, accused of being trans. And it's they make no distinction in these types of arguments.
That's exactly right. So the reality is the arguments that our opposition are using, particularly when it comes to sports bans, for example, are inherently misogynistic and anti-feminist, right? They argue that anyone assigned male at birth specifically, because most of these laws impact trans feminine people. They argue that anyone assigned male at birth is automatically and innately physically or athletically superior to any person assigned female at birth. That is categorically misogynistic and anti-feminist. Like, and women and girls come in all different shapes and sizes, right? So these trans sports bans run the substantial risk of policing cisgender women, as you already noted.
And we've seen it. We've definitely seen it happen.
Right. Who do not conform to white-centric conceptions of femininity, right? And we've seen it internationally. It's led to sex verification practices that disparately impact and abuse Black and brown women and girls. And it's led to intrusive medical testing and unnecessary physical examinations. And it's dangerous policing of women and girls' bodies. And it's the dangerous policing of femininity, right? And moreover, it doesn't actually even address gender equity in sports, right? If the concern is providing opportunities for women and girls to participate in sports programs, then the answer is to expand sports programs, not categorically prohibit a class of women and girls from participating.
And I mean, like I said, this is one of those conversations that there's so much that can be talked about. And as somebody with a lot of experience with exercise physiology and I know ways I can, dissect those different things, but I think you don't need to even get into that. You're right. It goes beyond that. And I think that, maybe, I get stuck on it too. Cause you're talking about it, you get so fired up about it and then you lose your train of thought. And I think that that's actually a good point to talk about. That is some of the goal of the opposition, to get you distracted from the actual issues, to get you so angry that your argument, you'll forget it or you'll make a mistake and, they'll capitalize on that. And maybe that's something that with your experience, I wanted to ask about your legal expertise, having to face these things in real life and in your job all the time. People in our community who are faced with these things, these attacks, whether it may be seeing it online or having it in person, verbally, just dealing with these arguments. How do you give some advice on how to handle that, approach those situations?
So I think it's important to remember that you needn't place yourself in a toxic, hostile, or unhealthy environment, right? If you are subject to abuse, then perhaps it's wise to consider an exit plan. Considering an exit plan doesn't make you a coward. Self-preservation doesn't make you a coward. It makes you wise. Indeed, it makes you brave enough to say, you know what, I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to do what I need to do to make sure that I'm okay, so that I can take care of me and I can take care of my loved ones. Because in some instances, when you speak with opposition, it doesn't matter what you say. You're not talking to them. You're talking past them. And oftentimes their objective isn't even to talk to you. It's to bait you. It's to make you appear unhinged. It's to make you engage in conduct that feeds into their narrative about trans and non-binary people. particularly when they engage with you on social media.
Yes.
So be mindful of that when someone starts harassing you online.
I'm definitely 100%. Sometimes that, and you can often tell when, based on certain things that people say, whether it's going to be a productive conversation or not. And I'm looking, of course, we get again wrapped up in a lot of the big issues, and it's really important. And it kind of feeds into my next sort of question. And we had talked about it a little bit before we started. How does the title of Miss Trans USA fit into this context? All of this, the social, legal, even just educational environment we're in now.
So, I mean, I think it's really important. I decided to compete for Miss Trans USA because I believe in the system's mission. Its mission is special, and it's centered around community representation and prompting important discussions about the community's needs, wishes, and long-term goals. Those are some tremendous responsibilities for the reigning title holder. As I've shared, I've dedicated my life in service of our community. And I believe the system's mission clearly provides its reigning queen must be prepared to commit to a year of service that could have life-altering results on other people's lives that may never disappear. Miss Trans USA is a representation of the trans community's humanity. She's a servant to the heart of our community's members that needs understanding, care, and safety. She can be an educator to minds that need enlightenment. And she is a beacon to those that need comfort. Finally, she is a visible symbol to trans and non-binary youth of possibilities. We already discussed when I was younger, I never imagined I would be a lawyer, that I would be the director of LGBTQI equality at the National Women's Law Center, that I would teach at Harvard, or that I would be an ACLU lawyer, or that I would be traveling the world to speak with government leaders or to advocate for LGBTQI equality, equity, and inclusion. And I also shared I'm 39. The average life expectancy for a trans woman of color is 30 to 35. And it's estimated another trans person is violently killed every 9 days. So throughout most of my 20s, I was convinced I wouldn't make it to 36. My primary objective was to simply survive. So the predominant factor between me and many other trans people I represent in my work is that I've met people who stood by me when others said no or closed doors in my face. And they kept me safe, and they never let me give up on my dreams. And they challenged me to achieve the potential that they saw in me. I want our youth to understand that with hard work, determination, and the right support, they can also achieve their dreams. Whether it's singing on Broadway like Peppermint and Jinx Monsoon, working at the National Women's Law Center like me, or traveling on a future mission to Mars. And I want them to know that I'm here to be that support if they need me.
I mean, that's a huge part of what did it for me. And even in doing it, I don't see in my life either a lot of people like me in terms of, the goals I had for myself educationally, and meeting people who want to get there where I am now is something that I never thought would happen as Mr. Trans USA. So you're absolutely right that this is a symbol of what's possible. And I think that, you have the perfect background to be able to share that with a lot of people, and you've traveled so much already. You've had these experiences, you're doing this work already. And I just kind of want to ask, do you have any one major goal, specific measurable sort of goal you want to achieve should you win Miss Trans USA, since you've already achieved so much otherwise?
I think my primary objective would be to create that stronger tie between community members and those doing movement lawyering, to demonstrate to more community members, particularly those who feel unheard, that those of us who do movement lawyering, like myself, are listening, and that we're here to help, and that we're being very intentional about the cases that we're bringing, and that we want to know what everyone's needs are.
I think that's a huge part of it too. I know personally, we've talked about sometimes people feel really overwhelmed with the process, even to getting connected with somebody who can help them legally. And I think that is a key piece. And having a nice go-between to be like, I'm a lawyer, but I'm also Miss Trans US, and people who may not have felt comfortable approaching someone in, let's say, a legal context can approach you as a human being. And I think that's going to be a huge help, definitely. So I have there's two more questions I think that are really relevant as we wrap up. And it's something that we can talk about our community specifically. But as you said, we're heavily targeted, but technically a very small portion of the population. And we rely on our allies to help us a lot. So I just want to ask, how can allies be better advocates for our community? And what advice if they make a mistake, let's say, would you have for them?
I think the first thing that allies can do is pause and listen. I think Sylvia Rivera, when she stormed the stage at the 1973 Christopher Street Fair, when she initially addressed the crowd, may have said it best to that crowd. She said, "Y'all better quiet down now." And when she said that, I think what she meant was, please take a moment and listen. Listen to what your trans brothers and sisters have to say. Listen to the suffering that we have to endure. And at that time, what she spoke about was the lack of shelter system for the number of displaced trans and non-binary youth. She spoke about the overwhelming number of trans and non-binary people who were subject to the carceral system, who were being abused on a daily basis, and who were in desperate need of medical care. Those issues haven't changed. What needs to change are people's focuses and people's ability to actually hear what our community's needs are. Your second part of the question dealt with what happens when people make a mistake. Apologize. Say you're sorry. And then ask what you can do to make it better. Ask how you can be a better advocate for the community. And then take a moment to learn a bit more about the community's history, right? Trans and non-binary people aren't new. We've been around forever. And we've been an integral part of not only the LGBTQI movement, but also of modern equality laws. I've already mentioned Sylvia Rivera, but I also want to mention two other role models of mine, if I may. The second is Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson, who was also very integral to the Stonewall Uprising, who was a integral member of the Queer Liberation Front, much like Sylvia Rivera, and who, like Sylvia Rivera, developed the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries that provided housing and support to many queer and trans and non-binary youth who were homeless during the 1960s and 70s. Marsha was also someone who was a leader during ACT UP in the midst of the HIV and AIDS crisis. And the third person I want to mention is another trans woman of color by the name of Deidre Farmer. Dee Farmer was subject to the carceral system, and she was repeatedly beaten and raped while she was subject to the carceral system. She brought a case on her own without legal representation, challenging the abuse that she suffered on an almost daily basis in the prison system, bringing an Eighth Amendment claim. She lost that case at the United States District Court, brought a case to the Seventh Circuit, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. She lost that case at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. And then she filed on her own a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, after seeking yet again counsel from many different organizations that told her no. The court granted her request to hear the case, and it was only after it granted her request that she was able to retain counsel to argue the case for her before the court. Her case was the first case that the court ever heard involving sexual violence in the carceral system. And her case was also the first case that set the standard of deliberate indifference in Eighth Amendment claims. Again, we've always been here. We've shaped the law. It's time that other people be here for us.
You wanna put that dish in your mouth?
Hi there, my name is Anya Marino. I use she, her pronouns, and I represent the District of Columbia. I want to take a moment to you to talk about the vicious attacks we've seen nationwide against trans and non-binary people that have caused all of us panic. Now, I refuse to sit here with you and tell you that your fear is unreasonable. It's reasonable and it's real. I feel it too. We all feel like we're suffocating. We all have moments when we quake with fear at the horrific reality that there are people out there who want to exterminate us, and that have said so expressly as part of their national platform. But here's what I know. Every day that we dare to live authentically and unapologetically is an act of courage. It's an act of faith that our lives have meaning. And it's an act of defiance against those who intend to do us harm. Each of us is a part of Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and Miss Major Griffin Gracie's legacy. Consider the achievements that our community has made over the last 51 years. Now consider the millennia during which LGBTQI people have suffered discrimination, persecution, and extermination. We as a community have accomplished so much over 51 years, indeed so much over the last 14 years. So I want to take a moment and just offer a few truths. So when life hurls challenges at you, you have a few devices to remember your inner strength and feel empowered. My first truth is you will experience disappointment. Although no one wants to hear it, it's everyone's reality. But remember, you're smart, you're strong, and you're resilient. Remember, your life has meaning. And remember that you are deserving of love and of happiness. Second, if you ever feel discouraged while striving to live your truth, surround yourself with people who are committed to seeing you thrive. Identify mentors who will nurture you and provide you guidance when you feel like you have lost your way. Let them provide you the strength and support you need when you feel too exhausted or defeated to continue. Let their faith in you reignite your passions. And if you find yourself somewhere where you feel unvalued or worse, unsafe, remember to prioritize your health and your safety. You needn't suffer somewhere that makes you unhealthy or unhappy. Remember your support system to help you determine your path forward. Finally, remember the courage you display every day to live your life in truth. It takes so much courage for everyone to discover who they truly are and to own it unapologetically. Your courage is inspiring. It inspired me to live my life the way I do. It inspires hundreds of lawyers, policy specialists, and organizers that advocate for trans and non-binary rights. And it will inspire future generations of trans and non-binary people to live their truths and to hopefully thrive. Bless you all.
Yeah, you wanna put that dish in your mouth.